So a body of evidence will contain data that are used to qualify the student. Again, those might be norm reference or criterion reference tests, a norm reference observation scale, or a performance evaluation. And there will be this additional data that goes into the body of evidence. That might include anecdotal records that the teacher keeps, again, a student interview, an informal observation of the student, or a checklist. But this body of evidence will then lead to developing the student's learning profile, and that learning profile will then become instrumental in developing the student's advanced learning plan, otherwise known as an ALP. Now, tests that provide quantitative data can be divided into norm reference assessments or criterion reference assessments. Let's review the difference between these two in terms of its purpose, its content, and its interpretation of data. So the purpose of a norm reference test is typically to classify students, to highlight their achievement differences. We typically rank order students, and their scores are compared to this larger group called the norming group. Now, test content is selected based on how well it discriminates those achievement levels among students. The data that we receive from these type of tests will help us determine a student's performance based on that larger group or that norming group of similar students. Students receive a percentile ranking score on a normed reference test. But that percentile ranking score often doesn't tell us, the educator, really what the student actually knows or is able to do. Now, an example of a percentile ranking that we're probably very familiar with is the standard ranking of a person's height based on your age and your gender. Now, if you're at the 85th percentile ranking, that means 84% of the typical population is shorter than you and 15% of the typical population is taller than you. A percentile ranking compares you to a normative sample. That normative sample is of similar gender and age. Now, the purpose of a criterion reference test then is to determine how a student compares to other students and to see how well a student has learned the knowledge and skills which they were expected to master. Therefore, test content is selected on the basis of what were the original learning outcomes? What did we deem most important for this student to learn? And we will select that content based on the significance of our curriculum or possibly our state standards. Therefore, the data that we receive gives us information on how well that student performed on the educational goals that were established, or those learning outcomes, or the state standards. And we receive either a percentage or a performance level on a criterion reference test. So let's look at the type of data we receive on a criterion reference test. Often we receive a percent correct or a designated performance level. Now, a student earning a 97% on, let's say, an end of semester math test means that the student answered 97% of the math questions correctly. Now, our state assessment, that is an example of using a performance level to measure how well students answered questions aligned to their grade level state standards. To earn a specific performance level, a student must be able to answer a specific number of test items correctly to earn their designated proficiency level. Before we move forward, there is a word of caution in using percentages for gifted identification from criterion referenced assessments. Let's take the example of a student that we think about identifying gifted in the area of mathematics. If a student gifted in mathematics scores a 95% on a grade level standards-based test, we would most likely use this data to build her body of evidence or her learning profile. But let's assume that this student is in an above grade level math class. We could then use that data for qualifying evidence for gifted identification. Now, Susan Asseline states a student scoring at the 85% or above on an above grade level assessment is a score that we can consider to be in the advanced or exceptional range for gifted identification. When considering state assessment data to make gifted determinations, the performance level of advanced was previously used with our TCAP assessment. With our new state assessments, the performance level of distinguished or exceeds expectations will be used as qualifying evidence for identification. Districts assess student achievement using a variety of instruments. These might include the use of a standardized achievement test, which is designed to measure the knowledge and skills a student has learned in school. Now, here are an example of commonly used achievement tests in Colorado. These assessments may be used for qualifying data to identify a student if the student scores at the 95th percentile or above. Now, districts also administer different diagnostic or inventory assessments typically used to measure attainment of foundational learning skills. An example of diagnostic inventories are those used as part of our READ Act. Now, diagnostic inventories are not used as qualifying data, as they are intended to measure grade level, foundational skills, and do not measure exceptionality. Now, we also have curriculum-based measures, which may include a common assessment a district creates or an end-of-the-course test, for example. Now, these may be used as qualifying evidence if they are off-level tests, as described previously. Now, a body of evidence often contains a cognitive test. Cognitive tests are designed to measure a student's general intellectual ability. Now, such tests do not measure specific academic aptitude in our various content areas such as reading or math. Now, we have two types of cognitive assessments widely used in Colorado, which include the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, also referred to as the NNAT, and the Cognitive Abilities Test, referred to as the COGAT. Some districts have chosen to administer the Cognitive Abilities Test. Now, the COGAT is divided into three separate batteries, or sections of a test. These sections, or batteries, are identified as a verbal battery, a quantitative battery, and a nonverbal battery. Now, it's important to note that the batteries are just composed of different types of questions, because all the questions within COGAT and within every battery measure the same thing, and that's general or fluid reasoning ability. Now, it is important to state that batteries are not used to identify a category of giftedness. So, for example, we don't identify students gifted in verbal or quantitative or even nonverbal. Also, Dr. Lohman, the creator of the COGAT, has stated that the composite score should not be used for identification purposes. So, for an example, an exceptional score in the verbal area does not always equate to a student who we're going to identify gifted in reading. Now, we do know there is a high correlation between the two. Likewise, a student who scores high in the quantitative battery doesn't necessarily mean that that student is going to be identified in the area of mathematics. Some districts have chosen to administer the COGAT screener as an instrument for their universal screening process. Now, the COGAT screener is shorter, takes about 30 minutes, and it may be used to select a group of students who then move on to additional assessment. The data that we receive from the COGAT screener may not be used as the criterion for identification, in other words, qualifying data. For those students who score at a certain level on the COGAT screener, the district would then want to move forward and administer a COGAT full battery to obtain the necessary information for possible gifted determination. Some districts also are administering the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test. This is a test of only nonverbal type questions and requires no spoken or written language to be able to answer these questions. But this type of assessment is still providing us that general ability score. Now, it is important to note that nonverbal does not indicate a type of giftedness, but rather describes the type of questions on a cognitive assessment. These questions measure general intellectual ability, or remember that fluid reasoning, by using pictures or images. In this example, the student doesn't have to read any text or compute with any numbers in order to provide a response to this question. Nonverbal is not a category of gifted identification in Colorado. Now, an exceptional score on a nonverbal battery does not necessarily mean a student is a visual spatial learner. The nonverbal test questions do not measure spatial ability because questions are not represented in 3-dimension. Students are not required to create a mental model or solve a problem with what's called a hidden fold. Now, other assessments would be required to determine if that student has exceptional visual spatial abilities. Visual spatial is really a learning style and is not an area of gifted identification in Colorado. Qualifying data can also be much more than a test score. Performance evaluation is an important component of a body of evidence. Examples of a performance evaluation may include a juried performance, national or statewide contests or competitions, the creation of a student portfolio, or classroom performance. The use of a normed reference observation scale is important to add to your identification toolbox. Now, these normed reference observation scales are used as qualifying data for gifted identification. These scales are a very valid and reliable way for educators and even parents to evaluate gifted behavior characteristics. We have 3 that are most commonly used in Colorado, and those are all 3 normed and provide us very valid and reliable results. Those are the scales for identifying gifted students, otherwise known as the SIGs, and the SIGs also has a parent form that can be completed as well. There is also the Gifted Evaluation Scale, known as the GES, and the Gifted Rating Scales, or GRS. Now, there is also a word of caution about using other qualitative observation scales. Now, there are other observation scales that are not normed reference, but we have seen very successful use of these scales in recognizing students with potential from underrepresented populations. 2 such scales that we often see used in Colorado are the Kingor Observation Inventory, otherwise known as KOI, and the Teacher's Observation of Potential in Students, otherwise known as TOPS, which is part of the U-STARS program. Now, important to note that data collected from KOI or TOPS provides information to build the student profile and perhaps move the student forward in the assessment practice, but we do not use that data as qualifying data for identification. Let's return to our common terminology. Gifted rules specify parents should be provided the opportunity to provide input into the gifted identification process. You know, parents provide valuable insight into their child's strengths and abilities and interests. Now, primary points for parent involvement in the process could be a referral or adding other important information to the body of evidence, such as a rating scale or other student-related data. So one note about parental input. If a parent is asked to complete that parent form that comes with the scales for identifying gifted students because it is normed reference, and they complete that form, it may be used as qualifying evidence for identification. However, if somebody else is also asked to complete the SIGs, for example, a teacher, that scale can't be used twice as qualifying evidence. So in review, a body of evidence is made up of many assessments. Some are used to qualify a student for gifted identification, and some are simply used to develop the student learning profile. It is now time for you to pause this webinar and review the assessments that make up your district's body of evidence. You will resume the webinar after you have discussed this with your group. Go ahead and pause the webinar at this point.